Welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about suspension, specifically springs, shocks, and what their jobs are in the car. This is something that I see a lot of misconceptions with. I definitely hear people ask questions about this kind of thing a lot, so I'm going to go through it. Now, if you like what you see here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us out on YouTube if you subscribe, like, all that good stuff to our channel. So let's get into it. So maybe you've seen a car sitting in a parking lot or driving down the road and like one corner's sitting real low, or maybe like one end is sitting real low, and you kind of wonder what's causing it to do that. What is the problem there? Why is that car sitting funny? The short answer to that is that it is probably a spring, and this would be a spring right here. There are several different types of springs, different things happen to them. Now, I've heard a lot of people blame that on the shocks. But the shock's job is not to control the ride height of the vehicle. This is a nitrogen or gas-filled shock, and when you compress it, you can see that it slowly rises back up. You've got to think about it a little bit too. Your car weighs probably 4,000 pounds maybe. No, say 1,000 pounds per each wheel. If I can take this between my two arms and bottom it out right like that quickly, one, this shock is probably not a real great shock, but two, that is not enough to hold up the weight of your car. The flip side of that is our spring here. Now this spring, this is a coil spring. I can compress it a little bit, probably not even enough for you guys to see it on the camera. It did move a touch though, but I can't compress this by hand. So when we look at that, the shock compresses very easily, the spring does not. So we can start to see that the spring's job is to hold up the weight of the vehicle. And really that's it. The spring's job is to suspend the weight of the vehicle, to hold it up. So you've got your wheel down here, your car up here, and this is holding up the weight. This is a coil spring. Another example of a spring would be a leaf spring. So these leaf springs, there's still some in trucks, but they're kind of going away. There's not a lot of them left. So this is a leaf spring, also made to hold up the weight of the vehicle. And probably least common, this is an air spring. So this rubber area gets filled with compressed air. Actually, if I squeeze on it, you can hear it come out. So this area gets filled with compressed air, and the compressed air in this airbag holds up the weight of the vehicle. This is probably your least common type of spring in a passenger vehicle. By passenger vehicle, I mean car and pickup truck. So you're probably not going to see a ton of these, but they do exist. This is an air spring. Actually, the old Lincolns and Mercury Grand Marquis had these in the rear. You would see the back end of them dragging. That's because these air springs had ruptured and they didn't have any spring anymore. And the last type of spring that I can think of off the top of my head, I don't actually have an example of it, but it would be a torsion spring. So this is just a piece of bar, ignore this end here. Basically you would have a nut-shaped piece on one end and a nut-shaped piece on the other end, and this spring would actually twist back and forth. That's a torsion bar or a torsion spring. So that's it. The short answer on springs, they are there to hold up the weight of the vehicle, keep the vehicle up in the air, and allow it to move up and down as it hits bumps on the road. So if the job of the spring is to hold the car up, what's the job of the actual shock absorber? So a shock absorber is there to limit oscillations, which is a fancy way of saying it is there to stop the springs from bouncing. So if you've ever driven a car that had bad shocks in it, maybe you hit a bump and it starts kind of doing one of these numbers, and it does it for like what seems like miles. That's an example of a bad shock absorber. So this is a different shock, but what this is, it's very difficult. I can pull this apart, I can push it back together, but it's hard to do that fast. This one is not nitrogen charged, so if I push this back in, it just stays. This is a hydraulic shock absorber. But the job of this thing is to make the springs so they don't just bounce. So what this does is it's hard to push in and out. It stays in one spot nice and easily. So while this doesn't hold the vehicle up, it does make the suspension work in a predictable manner. So you can get stiffer shocks or softer shocks, and that will change the way the vehicle rides. The same thing with springs is true. You can get stiffer springs or harder springs, and it does change the way the vehicle rides. So all this stuff, so we're kind of doing the basics right now, but the reality is you can go really deep into springs and shocks to make a vehicle perform in the way you want it to. From a strictly factory, what they do type of application though, the springs hold the car up, the shock smooths out the ride. Now there is one other option here, and this would be a strut. So this takes the place of some of your suspension components. It's got the coil spring in this one, and down in here is actually the shock. So this is a shock, a spring, and a mount, and it is actually parts of the suspension. Maybe you've heard the term coilover shock. This is off a snowmobile, but it is a coilover shock. We've got coil springs that are wrapped over top of the shock. This does not take the place of the suspension part like the strut, but it does have the shock and strut in one area. And most of the time when you're talking about coilover shocks, they are a performance type piece, and they do have some adjustability. So like this one, I'm not going to be able to turn it by hand, but this collar here actually threads up and down and can change the ride height of the snowmobile that this is on. Now, the other thing here is this chamber off to the side. This is a gas chamber. Now when I grab this blue shock, the gas chamber is actually at the bottom of this tube. So this canister that's on the coilover snowmobile shock is just built right into the bottom of this shock here. And what that does is it puts the oil under pressure, which will increase the boiling point of that fluid inside the shock and make it work in a more severe duty type of application. So that's what the gas charging in a shock is. It makes it work better under severe use. So if you've got something like the snowmobile shock, which if you've ever ridden on a snowmobile trail, they are bumpy and the shocks are constantly working and working hard. It gives you a little bit more assurance that they will continue to work rather than get too hot, boil, and not work anymore. I guess that's it. That's just a real basic look at what shocks and springs do in your vehicle. Like I said, there's a lot more to suspension, and there's a lot more to springs and shocks themselves. But thanks for watching. Again, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you later.